In this video, we'll discuss the following points and learn the trickier aspects of two-point perspective. We'll see how we can accurately plot scenes in two-point using a variety of tricks and revisit some of the concepts we first met while learning about one-point perspective. Make sure you spend 1 hour a day practicing the things you learn here until you can do them all. The link for this course's Anki deck is in the description, as well as a link to our Discord server so that you can help test if this is an effective way to learn these skills compared to more traditional approaches. When we draw in two-point perspective, you have hopefully noticed that rotating the scene objects causes the vanishing points for X and Z to slide along the horizon line. I think the reason that most people never quite figure out perspective is because they think that just placing these points wherever will make a two-point setup that works, but it won't. Here's what I mean. If I start drawing with the horizon line and I just mark the two vanishing points wherever I want, then when I draw the resulting boxes, they don't actually look correct. It's worth playing with this sliding of the vanishing points to see it for yourself. You will also hopefully see and appreciate that sliding them further apart produces a more flattened out view, and that bringing them closer together creates more of a fisheye effect. The problem this creates in your drawings is that the corners of your boxes need to feel like they are at 90 degrees and correct in perspective. This means there must be some kind of relationship between the object's rotation and the distance the vanishing points slide. So how do we work that out? I personally never measure anything like this video will demonstrate. I just know how to draw cubes that look accurate without measuring them, and that comes from observation and experience, not from using the stuff I am about to talk about. So while it is worth knowing and playing with for a while, you're actually better off just being very judgmental about your work and whether it looks correct or not. If you can draw enough boxes from reality and understand some of this stuff, then you should be able to make your drawings work. To make it perfectly clear, you can't just put your two vanishing points wherever you want and expect the outcome to look visually correct. So how do we know where exactly they should go? The answer is to use a plan view. Let's jump back into 1-point for a second. This is a plan view of a 1-point perspective setup. We draw our laser and a straight line connecting it to us. We call this point representing us the station point, and it is our position in space. We can then place a cube in front of us. This cube is a square here because we see it in a plan orthographic view. It fits inside our cone of vision, so we know we'll be able to see it with no distortion if we draw the scene out. We can move it along the z-axis to set its distance from our station point. If we draw that 45-degree line from our station point to the horizon here in plan view, it carries on forever, because there is no horizon. We can mark the same 45-degree line from the box corners, and see that both lines are parallel, continuing into space forever. One more thing to notice is that the line connecting our station point to the laser is also the center line of our vision in perspective. If we place the cube so its midline is on the center line, then when we see the cube, it will be exactly central to us. We could shift it left or right so that one edge lines up with our center line and the scene would adjust accordingly. That means we can use this to place things in the x-axis. Because this is a plan view, we do not know how high the cube is. It might be on the floor, but it might also be 30 feet in the air. We don't know, but we can position it in the x and z axes here. You can see that this plan view is a great way to map out the objects we want to draw and ensure that, apart from the y position, we can make sure everything will fit nicely inside the cone of vision and even work out the spacing of the scene objects, placing them on a floor plan or whatever else we want. Now watch this. We can use this plan view to actually make a 1-point scene perfectly. All we do is draw a horizon line through the laser. We can then use the cone of vision boundary marks and the 45-degree line coming from our station point to map the points we need for the scene setup. This is actually what we have been doing the whole time. We've been using plan views to map out what our eyes should see. Plans can be measured with 100% accuracy, so we can perfectly create a scene plan and then just translate it into perspective. We just need to figure out the y position of this cube. We can project the front edge of the square up to the point we want to set as the floor. Let's say the floor is here. We use the 45-degree line projecting from our station point to make a quick floor grid, and we can make it into perfect squares. Note how in plan view, the 45-degree lines running from us and the cube were parallel, but here they project to the same spot on the horizon. This is the only thing you have to change when you convert from plan to perspective, and it's a great rule to know. Parallel lines in plan view converge at the same spot on the horizon line in perspective view. That means this is just another vanishing point, but instead of having objects actually converging towards it, we're using it for making measurements. This is known as a diagonal vanishing point, or a DVP. We'll spend more time on this in a minute. Once we have our floor grid, we can place the cube on it, but how do we know how high it should be? Let's say this is a 1 meter cube. How do we know exactly where 1 meter high is in our scene? Well, in one point, we know that the front face is a square, so we can mark another 45-degree line from one corner to find the vertical square equivalent of the floor grid. This then becomes a measuring stick. If we mark this line as 1 meter high, we can use it as a measuring plane to translate the scale of 1 meter to anywhere else in the scene. These are all tricks you already know, and hopefully you can appreciate why they're all important and how they all come together to allow us to create scenes from plan views. Let's mark out 3 meters in the air and make another cube off the ground. Imagine if in plan view I shifted it right so that its left face is now on our center line. We can draw it like this. We can use the plan view to move it wherever we want. Let's also push it back to align its front face with the back face of the first cube. This is now a paper 3D modeling program. I'm plotting the XYZ coordinates of everything, and I've accurately figured out the scale in the scene, the position and spacing of my primitive forms, and the camera settings. I then draw my second cube in the exact position I want. So that was all in 1-point perspective, but what about 2-point perspective? Well, everything works exactly the same apart from one tiny difference, which is that the cube can now turntable. Because we know that squares fit tangentially around circles, we can actually just draw a circle wherever we want to place our cube in plan view and then turntable the square around it. Now watch closely because this is the important bit. We continue the cube's lines off into space here in plan view, then when we convert everything to our point of view, we can see that these lines will eventually hit the horizon line, and that is where the x and z vanishing points will go. This guarantees that the 90-degree angle we have here in plan view will be perfectly translated to 2-point perspective. The next problem is, how do we know where to mark the edges of our cube? The height for your scene is handled in exactly the same way as we did for 1 point. The only difference is that whereas before we had this front face of the cube we could use to find the height, here in 2 point all we have is a front edge. The x and y lines are a little bit more difficult to measure because they're now not square to us like they were in 1 point, but we can actually still draw the bottom edge of a 1-point cube to use as a measuring stick. We can then fire a line from the 1 meter mark to the relative vanishing point, and where it intersects any line, such as the ones we're using to define our cube, will be the location of this 1 meter mark in x and z perspective. Think of the measuring sticks as being a plate of glass we have inserted into the scene. This plane is what we're using to map out the correct scale, and then we just transfer it about. Once again, remember, I never measure stuff like this, honestly. Close enough is good enough. Just make sure that you can draw things that look correct, and that's all that matters. Most people would just trace over a 3D render these days anyway. But there's an issue here. Once again, we cannot tell exactly where the back edge needs to be placed to make this a perfect cube. You may remember that we achieved this previously in 1-point perspective by using a diagonal vanishing point. In 2-point perspective, we can do the same thing. We pick 2 opposing corners on our square in plan, and we draw through them until we hit the horizon line. This is now the spot that all of our perspective squares in this orientation will aim for diagonally in order to make our floor grids. You can then map out any more advanced boxes or forms using the extending and subdivision tricks that you know. Any boxes we draw in different rotations will require us to do the same thing, and that's because the DVP for every rotated cube is different. This means we actually have 2 overlapping grids with 2 totally different alignments, and normally each would be handled on its own piece of paper before producing a finished overlay. You can also buy pre-made sheets of these grids to help you save your time or make them yourself. Also, quickly, remember those circles we used to make our squares in plan view? Well, those circles would be ellipses now, and their degree would be worked out by the square. Remember, squares and circles are the same shape, and they help bring each other into existence in our scenes. The final thing to cover here, then, is a way to help you more accurately work with vanishing points located off the edge of your paper. Scott Robertson calls this the brewer method because he learned it from a guy called Brewer, so we'll credit him here too. It's very simple. Let's say we have a box and we draw the nearest 2 faces in 2-point perspective. The lines only converge a little, so the vanishing point is off the paper. Because there is some convergence and the lines are getting a little closer as they go, this method will work. We once again have this nearest vertical edge that we use for vertical measuring. If we divide it in 2, then we can find the gap between the lines at the edge of the paper and halve that as well. We then connect these lines. Let's repeat that a few more times, and you can see that we have this converging grid appearing. If we want to aim a line into perspective now, to these far-off vanishing points, we can either perfectly figure them out using this grid, or just eyeball it using the grid as a rough guide. You probably won't use any of this stuff to map out your scenes, and quite frankly, who can blame you? I certainly don't do it when I'm sketching, but if I was doing professional work, I probably would use it for my finished art. The thing is, though, I've done the hard work of drawing using these systems in the past, and so now I'm constantly aware of them, and I understand them even while I'm just sketching, and that is why I can draw things from any angle. Once you know the system, you control it. You don't have to draw this stuff out every time, but by spending some time doing it for just a little while, you internalize it, and then it becomes yours. I'm not the best artist, but after I learned this stuff across a 4-month period, it catapulted me ahead of a bunch of other people who still can't even draw a box properly. Can you map out a scene in 2-point and draw it with perfect 90-degree boxes? Can you draw the 5 primitives and ellipses in 2-point using these methods? Can you create a grid using the brewer method to help you aim for vanishing points off the page? Can you use circles to rotate everything in the scene to a different orientation? Over time, draw less and less of the framework until you can draw without it. Then ask yourself, does this look correct? If it seems distorted or wonky, then you probably need to work a little more at this until you can aim for vanishing points anywhere, on or off the page. And that's all this is, if we actually just remove all the framework stuff. You gain the ability to imagine exactly where your vanishing points are in space, even when they're off the page, without having to map anything out, and you can still aim lines accurately towards them. That's all any of your favorite artists are doing when they draw. So to recap, you learned that the station point and cone of vision and all that stuff is actually just a plan view, and is then converted into our point of view. That we find the vanishing points for 2-point setups by rotating squares around circles in plan view. That all parallel lines in plan view converge on the horizon line when seen from our point of view, and that we use this concept to find the diagonal vanishing points on our cubes. And that we can subdivide the vertical planes to help us aim towards very distant vanishing points. Make sure you can do the following before moving on to the next video. To make the challenge easier, go back to working in 1-point, then redraw the scene in 2-point. Use objects you find to make still life arrangements and work them out in plan view before tackling them in 2-point. This stuff is complex, but if you can figure out just one piece at a time, you'll get the hang of it. There are really only a handful of variables contributing to the final result here, so master them one at a time until you can use them together to draw comfortably in 2-point using this framework. To make the challenge harder, ignore all of the framework and begin developing the habit of intuitively drawing good artwork in 2-point perspective without setting any of this stuff up. Your lines should all still converge in the X and Z axes while the Y axis remains vertical, and you should be able to aim for any vanishing point, even one on the other side of the room. Remember, to practice drawing those straight lines, do you see why they're so important now? You should also look at the world around you and sketch from observation to make sure you can make a good 90-degree angle in perspective. Be very judgmental about your work now, and check it with a ruler to see if you really are hitting those vanishing points, or if you need to tighten up your game. You should be able to draw all 5 primitive forms in 2-point with no problem if you are good at this. Please ensure that you really can do this stuff before trying to move on. It really does take a little while to get your head wrapped around it all. Next time we'll add yet another vanishing point and see how 3-point perspective works. Keep practicing, and remember that there is an Anki deck available for free that recaps this lesson and schedules the practice for you. If you want people to practice with, I recommend joining this channel's Discord server, the world's biggest art learning experiment, where you can ask questions, get more challenges, and reinforce your learning amongst friends.